It's ad break time. I'm proud to announce that the Beyond Solitaire podcast is sponsored by Central Michigan University's Center for Learning Through Games and Simulations. They just successfully funded their most recent game, Greg Loring Albright's Keep the Faith, which is a light RPG about the growth of a religion. If you missed the campaign, do keep an eye out for a chance to late pledge in the coming weeks. Also, if you'd like to support Beyond Solitaire, please head to patreon.com/BeyondSolitaire to help me keep the lights on. For now, though, enjoy the show. Hey gamers, this is Liz Davidson from Beyond Solitaire, and this week on the pod, I have a very special guest. This is Professor Lars de Wildt. He is an assistant professor of media studies at Groningen. He can pronounce that better than me. He's also currently, this is like the coolest job title ever, a visiting professor at the Heidelberg Center for Apocalyptic and Post-Apocalyptic Studies. That's awesome. How are you doing today, Lars?
I'm good. Yeah, it's a beautiful Easter Friday. It's a good Friday to be awake, I guess.
Yeah, it is a good Friday indeed, right? Oh man, I forgot I was having a religious studies person out on the Easter weekend. But I actually had you on because I wanted to talk about your book, The Pop Theology of Video Games. Like that title alone immediately caught my eye. So for people who maybe need some context for the kind of work you're doing, what would you say that you study as a religious studies scholar? And then what specifically were you talking about in the pop theology of video games? Just like the synopsis so we can get into questions.
Yeah, so I guess I would be something like a sociologist of religion or something. Like I'm interested in how people construct together their worldviews. And media obviously play a big role in that. Like what we know about the world and how we know the world is mostly through screens, right? So I'm 37 and I've only visited like a handful of countries. I've been to like 2 places in the US, for instance. Most of what I know about the United States, and most of what people in the US know about Europe or China or anywhere in the world, we mostly, know through media. And so what I became interested in, I guess like 11 or so years ago, is how people construct their understanding of the world through popular culture specifically. And obviously, as the kind of like biggest cultural industry we have, right, this gets thrown around a lot. That supposedly video games sell more than movies and music combined. I'm sure there's some nuance to that, but to me, video games seemed like the thing to study. Partly also because you get put into these subject positions. You get assigned the role of American soldier or whatever. And a thing that I became interested in around 2014, which led to this book, is that my friends and I grew up in this kind of hyper secular country, right? I think the Netherlands, statistically, where I grew up, is one of the least religious countries in the world. I think the Czech Republic is kind of on par. But we were playing, World of Warcraft and Dungeons and Dragons and like all these kind of games where I was always like a priest and another guy was, a druid or a shaman or like a warlock and all these kind of like religiously themed things to do. We would get quests from gods and kind of get blessings and divinities and stuff. And that was all perfectly normal. And we didn't really think of that much. So once I got paid to think about that, I guess, my question for the book was like, why? Why do what turned out to be mostly secular game designers put religion in their products that sell really well, products like Assassin's Creed, World of Warcraft, obviously, God of War, Zelda, like the whole series. Most years, like top-selling games will have at least one title in there that's kind of like got religion in there in either like a central way or just like in a way that we forget about, right? So the question was, why? Why do they do that? I was specifically kind of interested in like the forgettability or the invisibility of religion. Like, why did, secular game designers make for, boys like me, games about religion when neither of us are religious? Like, what central role does religion take up in that kind of society? Why does it sell so well? And then finally, the book is called Producing and Playing with Religion or something, I think.
Yes, it is.
And so like the second part of that question is like, okay, what do players actually do with that? So yeah, that became a long project, and that book's been out for a while. I finished most of the work like before the pandemic, and then as everyone, probably experienced, things just kind of slowed down. But yeah, so now it's been out, I think, for 2 years or something. Yeah.
Awesome. So when you say secular, so most of my listeners, I do have an international audience, but a lot of us are going to be in the United States. So what counts as a secular country, and how did that impact? You went to Montreal to interview people about Assassin's Creed. You're on online forums, which I'm assuming were people from a lot of different places. So like, how do you define what is secular for the purposes of your work? And do you see the United States as secular or not? I'm just curious.
I mean, there's absolute definitions of this, right? So like the secular would be technically this movement away from religion as like a given, a decoupling of religion and state. But then statistically, demographically, we see that, the amount of people that identify individually as religious, outside of how the state functions and stuff like that, is actually rising globally, right? Europe is kind of the only place where people are less and less religious. But I'm going to have to be careful with my word. Like, I'm not good with demographics. I know that North America actually, so the US, including Canada and Mexico, recently like also showed a kind of dip in religiosity. But the way I use secularism in my book, I guess, is just like people that don't assign to an institutionalized religion, and very often don't, self-identify, self-describe as religious, right? So people that you would call, or that we could call, agnostic, atheist. I also, of course, like, pay just as much attention to players that are religious, so that are, the classics, like different forms of Christianity, which is very much still the dominant religion on Earth and in the US especially, and Islam, Hinduism, Jainism. I had a bunch of people in there, including like more minor religions. So the question was like, what do I mean by secularism? And I mean is mostly people that self-identify as not religious or belonging to a religious institution.
Interesting. Yeah, I think I don't remember the exact numbers, but my dad sent me an article about the numbers for religion in the United States, because of course my dad would send me that. It makes sense. But basically, Christianity is still kind of dipping, although it wasn't dipping as hard this year as it was in previous years. But there's just more and more Americans that identify themselves as like spiritual but not religious, or like I have some subset of spiritual beliefs, but I don't consider myself a member of an organized religion. Does that count as secular by these kinds of definitions? Because I feel like, so I live in a world where I'm an atheist, like just for full disclosure, and I feel alone so often. Like you can find little pockets of atheism and agnosticism in the United States, but it's something that you don't tell people up front ever, because you just don't know the response you're going to get.
Well, I mean, so like what I think is funny is that, first of all, there's like a lot of kind of cultural, social value put on religion, right? So it's not an individual thing of just like having faith that there is something or whatever. And secondly, what we see so I said earlier that the Netherlands and the Czech Republic are some of the most secular countries in the world. They're also the only two that I think in their language have a specific word for what you just said, which is that, you believe in something. You're not part of an institutional religion. I think in Czech that's nihilismus, but I might be very, very wrong. And in Dutch, I'm 100% sure of this. It's ietsisme, which means like somethingism. So what we actually see, and what I think, these video games that I wrote about are a sign of, is that when people actually decouple the state and their own kind of religious identity from an institutional religion, right? Like I'm not Catholic or I'm not Protestant or whatever. There is still some kind of, desire to connect with maybe the magic of it, or the structure of the rituals, or just the beauty of it. Like going on holiday to southern France or Italy and like stepping into a church. You don't have to believe in God for that, and you don't have to like follow the Pope or like read the Bible or convert to any kind of religion. But yeah, most people will have that kind of like desire.
Yes. So one of the major components of your book is talking about interviews that you conducted at Ubisoft, talking to people who were making Assassin's Creed. What made you choose to do Assassin's Creed as the game that you wanted to talk about? And also, like, how did you get in to do all those interviews?
I should say, as an academic, we always have this like, solid methodological kind of narrative. I wrote mine down a while ago, so I forgot it. So I can
You did describe it in the book, so
I can be like completely insincere. No, I mean, it is sincere, but it's not complete. It's not the whole story. If I say that Assassin's Creed, quickly became one of the best-selling franchises ever, it's one that is fundamentally about religion, right? Like, so for those who don't know the series, these games have always been about, Muslim hashashim, right? Assassins who are trying to protect this kind of like artifact that is found in Jerusalem. And the Templars, the Christian Templars, are trying to take that. And what kind of like becomes of that is this whole like franchise full of religious artifacts that are historically real and powerful, and that are then explained as sci-fi, right? So it's like this fundamentally obsessed with religion, like as a franchise, it's obsessed with religion, basically. And at the same time, it's very successful. And at the same time, it's made by what turns out to be, very kind of like almost aggressively atheist people at the start of it. So yeah, like theoretically, that would be like enough to select this as a good case. Practically though, and I definitely didn't put that in the book, it's also just a question of access, right? So if your second question is like, how did you get to talk to them? It's after trying so hard to talk to anyone I could, basically. Like I remember playing Horizon Zero Dawn and talking to the people from Guerrilla Games, saying like, look, can I just be an ethnographer with you for like a couple, like give me like an internship or something. I'll just stand by the water cooler and like talk to people and observe things. I got very close to like being able to do that, but basically Sony didn't like that, or that was their excuse. Maybe they just didn't want like a nosy ethnographer there. So I tried everything. Like I got a scholarship from the International Game Developers Association in 2017. So I went to like GDC, where a lot of the kind of AAA game designers come together. Tried to talk to everyone, but eventually it was just moving to Montreal for like a couple months. I think 4.5 months I was there. That was the trick. I have another friend called Peter van den Heide. He did the same thing to like a Swedish game studio called Paradox.
Yes.
And he basically just like showed up at their doorstep every day until they talked to him. I did it a little bit differently, but at some point you get some informants, you get access to a network of former workers and workers. Most people were not anonymous or anything. Nothing, well, accidentally in retrospect, something NDA was disclosed. But like mostly I wasn't like, they learned very quickly that I wasn't like a scary journalist. I wasn't out to get scoops. I was just a very boring academic who was going to probably take years to write a book. And like I wasn't going to write down anything nasty. I just wanted to reconstruct like how did that franchise come about. And I'm proud to say I was able to do that. Like I talked to, at that point, would have been every creative director. So like every person who like comes up with the game
Yeah.
traditionally, like ever from like the first one. I talked to, you know, everyone on the brand team, which is very cool about Ubisoft. It's like, it's a big organization. It's also somewhat of a burnout factory, but there's like a couple people kind of controlling the end product and making sure that it's all consistent. And so I got to talk to many of those. Yeah, I just got really, really lucky, I think, just hanging out in the right bars. And at some point, like, if you start talking to people, or if you can tell them like, oh no, but Patrice Desilets already said yes, right? Then, you know, other people want to join in as well.
So how do you I mean, let's just say that at least in the United States, if you come up to somebody and you ask if you can talk about religion or Jesus, they automatically think that you're trying to convert them to something and that you're
Okay.
a cult. So how do you approach conversations about these topics with people that you are interviewing?
I guess I leveraged some kind of like naive Europeanness or something. But I basically approached people saying like, this is my topic. I'm interested in why religion. I'm talking to these people. Would you also like to like sit down? I'll get you like, I'll buy you a drink or a coffee. I think I spent most of my PhD salary on like getting game designers who made it 3 times, 10 times my salary, like getting them coffee, because that's all I could give back, right? Yeah, I don't know. I just told them like, this is what I'm interested in. Why did you put the religion in there? Who makes decisions anyway? Come talk to me. Maybe they just came for the coffee.
I mean, fair enough. So a lot of this is covered in the book, but I'm going to ask also, just so y'all know, this book is available for free and I'm putting it in the show notes. So you should go read it. We'll flag that again later. But when you ask people about why religion, how many of them had, I guess, like a actual answer to that question? Because I feel like religion's something that people kind of feel instinctively about, but don't approach critically. So how did that come out in the answers that you got?
I was met with like so many confused game developers. Like, again, Assassin's Creed is about like the apple of Eden and like Templars and Muslims and like throughout history, these kind of like religious groups. And then I talked to them about it and they would still go, so what does that have to do with religion? Like it's such like a staple of video games that I think it's almost become invisible. And I think people kind of assume that if a video game has religion, or if anything has religion, that it has this kind of like missionary goal, that it's trying to make people religious. So one of the kind of silly hypotheses I had is that, you know, Ubisoft is secretly a Christian organization trying to like popularize the Bible with kids or something. It's not. So like mostly responses were met, like I was met with confusion, like what does that have to do with religion anyway? But yeah, that's why interviews take like an hour, and by the end we have like a good picture of that. Yeah, I don't know, I forgot, what was the initial question again?
Oh, basically, like, you know, did most people have a real answer about why there was religion, or
Yeah, and it was mostly to do with atmosphere. So one thing that I learned about game development, which I'm learning again now that for my new project, I'm trying to interview people who make Call of Duty. It's not about religion, it's about another kind of worldview, I guess, military interventionism, whatever. But one thing I learned is that, you know, thousands of people for like years, or in the case of like the first Assassin's Creed, like only 200 something people for like several years, but still like a lot of people work on one title. Takes them a long time, and they're all kind of like, what do you call that? Like when horses have, like they have blinders on, basically.
yeah,
They look at like their one tiny thing. And so the fun thing is that to like get them to talk to them all separately and reconstruct what they're doing. I mean, there are of course like people who have the overview, and that by definition is the creative directors. That's you know, in the end, I think those were the most helpful interviews to get like a good idea of like how choices were made. And it turns out that the reason religion is in there, very often people explain it as like a form of atmosphere or magic, narrative kind of like directors and writers and whatever, they usually explain it by saying, look, it's just like an easy way to explain things. So outside of Assassin's Creed, the classic example would be the Paladin. If you have any game, if you pick up like a new board game or a tabletop game or like a new video game RPG, and you see a class that has like a big shield with like a cross on it, you immediately know what the magic comes from. Like, okay, they're like obsessed with some divinity and they have like a strict rule set and they're probably like lawful good. You don't have to explain that. So that was one explanation, right? It's like just practical. The other one was atmosphere. And then when it came to Assassin's Creed, the answer was very clearly that it started from like a Quebecois, specifically like French Canadian view on religion, which is that, you know, they were all children of the Révolution Tranquille, is what they call it. So it's this kind of like myth or self-narrative of Quebecois religiosity, that they were all Catholic, and then one weekend they woke up and they didn't want to go to the church basically anymore. Like they all became atheists. And Patrice Désilets specifically had this kind of like very, very anti-religious, anti-dogmatic message that he wanted to convey with the first, what was going to be like a trilogy, the first 3 Assassin's Creed. That was taken out, of course. Like Patrice was just as like, if a game designer becomes too big, Hideo Kojima even, right, was like the famous game designer of the Metal Gear Solid series and later Death Stranding and so on, was fired. And like usually the political economic kind of explanation is that you don't want like a big icon to lead a game because it's not always great for profit. You don't know what they'll do. You have to pay them a ton. You kind of want to let a franchise kind of like just be reproducible. And so that's what Ubisoft did very well, I would say. So they got rid of Patrice Désilets, and they made it into a formula. And that kind of like anti-dogmatic, you know, reason to put the religion in there, this actual ideological reason to put religion in Assassin's Creed initially, was taken out. It became a game that, for better or worse, right, was made to kind of please everyone and sell to everyone. So you don't want like a bunch of like, I don't know, you don't want gamers in Indonesia, which is, you know, not just a Muslim majority country, but like where most of the Muslims in the world live. You don't want them to not buy a game because it has, or like because it has the suggestion that Muslims are bad, right? The same for Christian minorities and whatever, and especially when it comes to like more recent history than the Crusade period. That became an important part of Assassin's Creed, kind of like depoliticizing that, making just, again, you know, like I started out saying, religion about a sense of atmosphere and like magic and ritual and structure. Yeah.
Oh man, this is interesting. So I'm not saying that we should hurt people or be mean about other people's religions. I do think it's a little sad that like an artistic vision gets whacked in pursuit of just kind of like everyone can be cool with this. But it leads me to another question, which is, so in your studies so far, where is the line between this is religion as background noise, maybe I don't even notice it, people just accept it? How does it tip over into, this is religious messaging and I'm going to respond to it differently? Because if you walk up to somebody, as we mentioned, right, you say, I want to talk about Jesus, everyone's like, whoa. But if you just put it in the game, it's almost like people don't consciously think about what they're doing. Like, how do you keep it seamless, and like where can you see like breakthrough into consciousness when you study these things?
Yeah. So there's 3 answers to that. And like the basic one is that, largely it depends on the player, right? So like when I did research into like player discussions and when I interviewed players, it quickly became apparent that players from different cultural and religious backgrounds would read games differently. There's the famous story of like the person who returned Bioshock Infinite, right? Because it had the baptism scene in it, and you couldn't play the game without being baptized as the character from a first-person perspective. So you very much identify with that. If you didn't get baptized, basically. So this person very publicly, dramatically returned it. This wouldn't have been a problem, obviously, if you're okay with that, or if you just don't care very much, right? So the first answer is like games become preachy or uncomfortably religious depending on the player. It's that simple. But that's also a really boring answer, because like we can see in general that there are trends that game developers have figured out, right? And especially marketing teams, brand management teams, whatever, they know how far to go. And so the other answer to that is basically just stick to Christianity is the rule. Because like Christianity, especially kind of like Catholic, harmless, magical stuff, right? Candles, incense, and nice like European churches, church architecture, like those are seen as non-threatening to the widest audience, apparently. The same goes, I guess, for like Zen Buddhism and stuff. I interviewed a lot of indie developers, right? So people who work outside of big companies like Ubisoft by themselves about this question, like, why don't you put your own religion in there? And they were like, yeah, I mean, if we make it anything else than generic Catholicism, basically, it becomes about that. Like we have to explain that. And then there's, of course, like a third category, which, especially older listeners and older people like us would like know, which is that you used to have like, yes, Christian games, but they were so objectively preachy, right? Bible games. They don't really exist anymore because the budget for games and making games in general, there's so much like labor and capital needed for that. That we don't see those anymore. But I mean, that's the final category for where it becomes clearly like no longer an invisible kind of religion, which is where, the preachy, pedagogical Bible games.
Yeah. This is a larger question. I mean, I don't know if anybody can actually answer this question, but I just want to talk about it now. So, I feel like this invisibility aspect, like what is the least offensive? It also sounds like kind of white, kind of male. Like it fits
Yep.
right into all those descriptions of right, like whiteness as normal, masculinity as normal, and therefore invisible. And now, Catholicism, normal, invisible. Have does your work kind of like touch on those larger issues, or is that something that's like in the back of your mind as you're working?
Yeah, let's talk about hegemony. Because it's true, like certain categories, including the category of like mildly inoffensive, European-y Catholic, but also, whiteness of male, of often male main characters. Certain things move into the background, they become invisible. This is a very common concept, obviously, to call that hegemonic, right? But whatever conforms as close, relatively closely to like a picture of an arbitrarily made dominant culture becomes invisible. And so absolutely what I just said about Catholicism in games is part of that. That's partly historically, right? Because Egyptian Dutch game designer Rami Ismail once told me, and I love this quote, so I want to attribute it to him. He said, look, if games had originated in the Arabic world instead of, as they just so happened to do, like in the US, then the paladin, for instance, wouldn't be a neutral character. It would be an invader, right? And so we just have this kind of like historical hegemony that is reproduced, not just in games, not just when it comes to religion, but everywhere. The shadow side of that, of course, is that we also have a kind of like a marked other. If you do want to make something look scary, if like in strictly English language media, classically, right, every Disney movie, you have like a white male hero or a woman or a white woman, right? And you give them an American accent. If you have a villain, you give them a British accent, right? But like in video games, we go a little bit further than that, I would say. And so, how do I say this in a way that you don't cut this from the podcast? But like basically, we shouldn't be surprised that if we've just spent 20 to 30 years in video games playing, white American soldiers and superheroes and so on, and shooting brown people in kind of like vaguely sandy Middle East, whatever our imagination of the Middle East is, kind of settings, we shouldn't be surprised that after 20, 30 years of that, in 2025, we seem to not care about seeing, those people, but the actual people, so like being burnt alive. There are places, these kind of like Call of Duty maps, right, being reduced to rubble, because to us, they've become this kind of like anti-hegemonic other that we don't identify with, right? I'm talking about us, white people, the main audience for video games still, if you look at what sells, that are completely ignoring an ongoing genocide. You might say, right, if you're the International Court of Justice or South Africa or Lars de Wildt, you would call this a genocide, no doubt, no stutter. And we're completely ignoring that. And then it's partly because of hegemonic reproduction of, white male American military interventionist, hegemony. And that includes very much the kind of othering, not just of race, not just of gender, but also of religion, right? The idea that we very often kind of dismiss brown lives all over the world, right? For lack of a better word. I don't know if that's the right way to say this in English. I'm sorry if it isn't. But, a lot of that is often veiled under the excuse of like, oh, it's Islamophobia, right? Dutch right-wing politicians have for many years been saying, we're not racist, we're just Islamophobic. We're just so secular that we are above these religions of violence. And that is why, for instance, Gazans or, Palestinians or anyone who isn't, white and secular, like us Dutch people or whatever, educated Americans, don't really deserve the same kind of sympathy. And that's very much been reproduced in video games, and religion is very, very much an excuse for that.
So this leads me back around to one of the earlier points that you made, like right at the start of your book, which is that especially in secularizing societies where like church going is low, and I'm not saying that we need to fix this by people going to church, because God forbid, but if this you're saying that video games and like sort of these pop culture representations of religion are in a lot of ways people's main exposure to religion and religious ideas. And so, what does that mean? Like, if everything is just sort of invisible and it's normal and you don't think anything of it, then what is it doing to you when you're kind of sleeping on that?
Yeah, I mean, that's the core question in my book eventually. So, like, if we have the observation indeed that, like, we see religion so dominantly in games, and then if we look at, which games sell and how many hours the average kind of European, North American spends on these video games versus, how many of them go to church or are baptized or like, do their bar mitzvah or, whatever kind of religious ritual. It is kind of like a counterintuitive, but statistically likely very correct observation to make, that most people encounter religion in video games and not in a church or a synagogue or whatever, right? And so how does that change religion? Because it does seem to be that, like, even if we're not religious or practicing religion, we do very much like to buy things that have like a surface level religion in there. What do I mean by surface level? It means that, you have the audio and the visuals, and like you even in video games specifically, you have the ritualistic kind of like structure of it, potentially. There are some very good analyses also of how, and this is by Robert Geraci, who writes in Virtually Sacred, a great book about Second Life and World of Warcraft, that non-religious groups end up in like practicing a kind of solidarity and a kind of like social function that he says are just basically indistinguishable from church groups, for instance, right? It's, taking care of each other, checking in on each other, the same way you might say that, people who aren't religious, but they really love one football club have what we call religious functions. It's funny, like religious functionalism comes from, like squarely the work of Émile Durkheim would be central to that, originatory for that. And he actually uses the word play much more often in that book on religion than he ever does, any of the famous terms about effervescence, right? This collective experience of religiosity. And so you might say, on the one hand, especially more social games or anything that binds people, including, the play of football or video games or board game groups, whatever, has, religious functions outside of institutional religion. But like, secondly, I feel like there's something else going on that when people only engage, and then I'm back to like the topic of popular AAA video games like Assassin's Creed, God of War, whatever, with kind of like the surface level magic and atmosphere and, the sounds and the feelings of religion without maybe the moral code or indeed the community, then we get a kind of, a simulacra of religion, if that word makes sense. So if like a simulacrum is way back before Baudrillard popularized that word, kind of like a bad copy of a god, right? What Christians what in Judaism and Christianity and all and like Islam would be called an idol, right? I think something like that might be the case for video games. Like we only kind of get the surface level nice things about religion without, the work of it, the faith of it, without, making it something that guides your life and your worldview. And I'm not judging that. I'm not moralizing that. I'm not deploring that. I'm not Nietzsche saying, oh no, we lost God, we killed him. But I do think it changes how we should think and talk about religion in this case, because maybe the case isn't so much that people are becoming less religious because they're not going to church and not, associating with an institutionalized religion anymore. Maybe we have just the same desire. It's just been kind of commodified and standardized and completely reduced to like a simulacrum of religion through video games and other such popular culture consumption of it.
Ew, that is really interesting. I'm going to think about this. So what I want to ask you though is the other part of your book is talking about how players respond to religion, such as it is, in their video games. And a lot of that involves, looking at forums, looking at online commentary. And I'm just fascinated by this. So I always ask academics who like work with this kind of data, how do you choose what forums to look at? How do you decide what you're going to take seriously in all of that chatter? Because so much of it is just kind of throwaway chat. And then, how do you like kind of sift through and pick what counts as evidence when you're making an academic point?
That's a great question. Also because like I was very overly ambitious with that study. It was the first study I kind of did for my PhD. I was, transitioning into like being a social scientist. It was also like 2015 or something. So obviously the social media landscape has changed since. Like my more recent studies, mostly on other things, like obviously veer toward, more toward Instagram, Twitter until a couple of years ago. And like these things change, right? So if I would do it next year, possibly TikTok would not be as interesting. Twitter is called X now. Facebook is for very few people, and most of them are bots. We would probably like have to look more at Xiaohongshu, right? If I'm pronouncing that anywhere near correctly, right? Some people call this Red Note. So, these kind of the places where people talk online, simply said, change. And back then in 2015, there was still a lot of like Reddit was very dominant. and video game forums were still a thing, like, believe it or not. And so I just selected for like, okay, which are the most active ones? Where do most people veer to on the Anglophone internet, which thankfully is a legitimate position when knowledge production is mostly done in English anyway, when video games mostly, at least then, like originate from the US, like produced in the US with an American audience in mind. And so I just picked the main ones. Game Facts FAQs were a big forum back then. I even forget the names. God, there was like the really good one that you had to like kind of semi be invited to, Neo something. Anyway, I just like took the ones that were popular then. Again, in 2025 or 26, they would be very different websites or platforms. But yeah, I took them. And then I like overly ambitiously just collected way too much. I looked at like anywhere they would like be talking about religions or religiosity or religiousness or any of the major religions, and I selected for that. Looked at like engagement, so like where is like most of the material, and then I did something that academics call thematic coding. So, and again, I was overly ambitious. I wouldn't do this now with some more experience, and I would probably automate parts of this. But I read way too many discussions, basically, of people fighting online about what games mean and what we should do with that and how that differs based on their religious position. And I just coded for like, eventually the main things that I noticed, the patterns that kept coming back. This is like what coding means, I suppose. Like you notice things, and then once they come back, this becomes like a thing you code for. I should probably not be a methodological instructor, which unfortunately for my university I am. But was that like people announced their religious position, right? So they would be talking about BioShock Infinite or Assassin's Creed or Final Fantasy or whatever, and they would like very often start their post by saying, well, as a Muslim, I think this or that, and then they would they would have different interpretations of games than, you know, from each other, obviously. And what for me was so obviously, like you have a podcast a long time ago with Adrian Shaw, if I'm not mistaken, right?
Yes.
And so Shaw's work on this is much better. But it's basically an encoding, decoding question. And so, of course, we know that people from different class backgrounds, cultural backgrounds, religious positions, gender, whatever, like interpret games, well, and like any kind of like cultural text differently. They associate or identify with like different characters. They interpret things differently. That makes sense. What I found particularly intriguing is that like as academics, and also as game developers, we have these very strong ideas of like, this is the kind of worldview I want my game to kind of like emit. Look at how clever we are with like the procedural rhetoric. Ian Locus calls it that. But then gamers don't really care. Players just don't care. And so you would have like, there's these really good publications by people like Frank Bosman, a theologian, who like has, you know, article length and book length analyses of Assassin's Creed, BioShock Infinite, these games that these players were talking about online. And yeah, players don't care. For them, it's like it means something completely different. So for one group of gamers, Assassin's Creed was, you know, the most anti-dogmatic, anti-religious game ever. And for like a whole other group, that same game, they played, you know, the same thing, meant something else completely. But yeah, that was a lot of work, like reading through, it must have been like tens of thousands of angry people talking to each other online. It took me more than a year.
So, you know, you mentioned that you're doing new work on Call of Duty. So just like how are you taking what you've learned from the previous experience and applying it here?
That if I'm focusing on like how people talk about or interpret a game, I'm going to either automate it or keep it very small scale, right?
What does automate mean?
Oh, I mean, so like if you're looking at like 10,000 forum threads, then there's very good, supposedly very good quantitative like content analytical methods that just like kind of, you know, whether through corpus linguistics, where you compare a set of text to like a representative, really large set of text to see like, oh, which words are used more often than in the newspaper, for instance, right? That's one method to kind of see and automate like what do these people talk about and how do they maybe talk about it in ways that are different from the norm, right? So, oh, players seem to talk a lot about religion. How? People do sentiment analyses, topic modeling. I don't know. I'm not very much at home at that, but if I would do that again, I would definitely not, you know, as a human, manually read all of that and code that. And supposedly there's very good methods for that, and you can learn methods, or like find co-authors to do that. Or I would like do it more small scale. So I found it in the end much more helpful to like select players really well. So like if you're interested, so if we know from the literature that Muslims, Christians, and atheists all understand the same game differently, then you let them play the game and you interview, theoretically selected people from different religions, and that usually gives much more rich data than that. So that's one thing I learned from this project. The other one is that turns out that if you want to talk to like people who make games, you just got to show up on their doorstep. So I guess I should go to Wisconsin, Madison for Activision at some point, and Shanghai, obviously. Yeah.
Indeed. So what is the scope of your Call of Duty project, and what kinds of data are you currently collecting for it?
So like if the interest for me has always been about like how worldview is produced by games, right? And like why the people who make them do that and how the people who play them might understand it differently. For the first book, it was about religion. This one is, I guess, about military hegemony. And I'm particularly interested in looking at that now, again in 2025, because we're suddenly in a situation. And when I say suddenly, it's like, it seems like this has happened really, really quickly, where 25% of the income from selling games globally comes from Chinese people. And that poses a really, really interesting challenge for specifically that part of the game industry that reproduces American military hegemony, right? So if you look at the best-selling games over the last decades, almost every year, the best-selling game is a Call of Duty. And very often in the top 10, there's another Call of Duty. And in most of those games, you're an American soldier in like, kind of like vaguely desert-like or another kind of terrain, but it's always that, or a British soldier in some of them. I'll have to give them that. And why that's interesting to me is that Chinese players don't necessarily identify with that. Like American military aggression in 2025 from like a mainland Chinese position doesn't sell really well. And then
I wonder why.
It's never been super popular anywhere, even within the US, I would say. But it sells. It's become a neutral kind of thing, and I think Chinese player preferences break with that. But more importantly, their like state has a policy. This is how I got interested in that. It's like very strong policies. Like there's several government ministries kind of like deciding which games are allowed inside the Chinese market, right? Which again has become a huge, very difficult to ignore market, and it's still growing. And so you have to get through censors. And the reason I got interested in this is because religion was always filtered out, right? So notoriously, World of Warcraft is one of the very rare kind of like Western games that became a huge success. And a lot of like the surface level religious stuff was taken out. But also for some reason, all the skeletons, like every time you see like a skull in World of Warcraft, in the Chinese version, it's replaced by a piece of bread. whatever. And so I'm curious about how the game industry will change, the video game industry specifically, how it will change based on those like Chinese state policies and player preferences. And I'm using Call of Duty as a primary case study for several obvious reasons, but also because they were doing that really, really early. What's really impressive is that already in 2012, they were working on Call of Duty Online, which was Chinese only and did relatively well.
That's really interesting.
Yeah. Thanks.
So this is maybe a stupid question, but I'm assuming that, so when you go online, you can play with people in servers all over the world. So even if you're in China playing a censored game, are you showing up in servers with people from other countries as well, and you just see something different, but it's like a swap in, or is it an entirely different server and an entirely different game?
It used to be the latter. So it used to be really, really entirely different games. And we are moving toward like a kind of like simultaneous release globally. Because again, video games take a very long time and a lot of labor, like a lot of people, a lot of capital to make. And so making separate versions, I expect will not like be, what's the word for that in English? I don't know.
Well, feasible, doable.
It's going to be feasible for a long time. Yeah. Like it's just going to be too expensive to make separate Call of Duties the whole time. Like if you look at the 2015 Call of Duty Online, like what eventually was released, it's so different. Like obviously there's more Asian characters that you play. But also like instead of like the traditional enemies, right, terrorists, let's say, they shoot monsters in that one. And it was also the start of like what became the kind of like goofy side of Call of Duty, away from the military realism, like having all the kind of like cartoonish guns and like bright colors and stuff. But that was such a big effort that the game industry is kind of going toward making one release for everyone. What exactly that will look like, we're only still like starting to see. But yeah, I expect that if players from mainland China and like international editions get to play together, right? So the version that right now people in Taiwan might be playing, or in Japan or whatever, then the usual trick is to have like server side the basics, and then on your computer you see the different thing. This is nothing new, right? America's Army, the famous U.S. military built AAA shooter that was released on the 4th of July, I think, in 2002, like a year after 9/11. That one always had players, server side being equal, but then on your screen you would always be the American soldier. You would never play like the other side. You would never play the terrorists.
Yeah.
I think David Niebuhr calls this the swapping paradigm. Sorry, I'm an academic, like in the sense that I'm super neurotic about wanting to like not sell other people's ideas as mine. So
yeah.
If it's annoying, cut out.
No, it's good.
The times that I say, "Oh, as this person said," but that's Niebuhr, David Niebuhr. And I think that will be the solution for now, right? If everyone's playing Call of Duty Warzone or Call of Duty Mobile, then the players in China will just see a slightly different game, maybe. We already see the promotional concept art, though, like the posters and stuff, and the game covers, if you still buy physical games, they won't just have the white male soldier anymore. There's like a Chinese soldier next to it, right? So together, we can kill the minority or the majority world. And so I do see a kind of change there that I don't quite know how it'll develop, but I have 4 years to study that. So
yes. I really want to touch base again when you are done with this study, because I just want to know. But it also sounds to me like the true way to change hegemony is money.
Yeah. I mean, the frustrating thing, like, we have so much discourse academic, but also popular, political, whatever, about representation, right? So we all know that it is important for people to be able to recognize themselves. Cynically, I want to say maybe we shouldn't have to recognize ourselves in, war or whatever. Like I don't have to have my bombs or my warships named after women necessarily. Just like stop killing people maybe for oil and stuff. Saying this to no one in particular, right? But in any other capacity, we know that it's important for people to identify themselves, to see, growing up as like I don't know, like a girl or a woman of color, like to see yourself as a superhero as well. We all know that's important. We've been talking about that for decades now, and nothing really much has changed. But then Chinese people turn out to like buy a lot of games, and suddenly everything's possible. So absolutely, I think ideology is made not by thoughts and figuring things out. Ideology is kind of made by actions and money. And so you might say the only conclusion is to like look at the world through a Marxist lens, or at least that, discourses of feminism and inclusivity and representation are impossible unless you, take a Marxist lens to that and include class to that. But maybe I'm just a brochurist and like a class reductionist if I say that. But this is something that actively I'm trying to kind of reflect on and figure out in my work. But it does seem to be that money talks. Yeah.
Yes. Well, you know what? Let's just make an appointment for whenever you're done with this study. And we'll touch base on how it turned out. So now it's time for some softy questions. But the first one I have to ask is, I just need to know, why is there a Center for Apocalyptic and Post-Apocalyptic Studies? Because that's awesome. And then what are you doing there specifically? Because I'm really hoping that video games are not bringing about the apocalypse. Hee hee.
They're not, but we are rehearsing the apocalypse very, very, very often in them, right? If we look at games like Fallout, and I'm playing a lot of Pacific Drive right now, which is super exciting to me. It's for me, it's almost a fantasy game because I don't have a driver's license, and like it's about driving a car and fixing it constantly, and it's after some kind of collapse, right? And so it's a relatively popular genre of movies and board games and video games and like popular culture in general to think about the end of the world and the kind of like bit that comes after that. It's maybe, you could say, a fundamentally religious obsession also, right? That every society and every culture needs its, end of the world narrative. But yeah, it's a pertinent question in general that people at the Center for Apocalyptic and Post-Apocalyptic Studies, it's suddenly a mouthful, think of a lot, which is that, like if climate change comes, if, a nuclear war might again be a possibility, if, all these possible ends of the world are suddenly on the table again, it seems. How do we think about that? How do we deal with that? And there's this famous quote by either Frederick Jameson or Slavoj Žižek, and repeated by Mark Fisher. There's a really complicated genealogy of that. Like they literally don't agree who said it first, which is funny. That like we imagine the end of the world so often. Like 90s disaster movies were great at that, for instance. I don't know why the 90s were such a safe space to imagine that. And so like we imagine the end of the world so often, but we never kind of imagine the end of capitalism or the world as it is. So one thing that I'm studying is like, if we imagine the apocalypse, like where is the apocalypse? And like Pacific Drive says a lot already, but like Fallout is a great example as well. It's always like in the US. What happened to the rest of the world? Like, did that ever exist or whatever? How did the world end? Like, how do we imagine it? Is it like a disease? Is it like a zombie thing? Is it whatever, right? So we have all these fantasies, and then we kind of imagine like what remains, and having trading, having money, having profit incentives, being very selfish and looting are often very important parts of the post-apocalypse. So again, this is like a third separate project ostensibly, but it all comes from an obsession of like, how do we understand the world? How do we construct worldviews through playing them, right? Through looking at virtual worlds and walking through them. Who are we in those worlds? Are we American soldiers? Are we Christians? Are we looking for the apple of Eden? Are we looting like empty things? Yeah, so this is just like another aspect of that question of how do we construct our worldview, in this case, after the end of the world.
All right, maybe 2 future podcast episodes. But but for now, I normally ask people what their favorite game they've been playing recently is. So I'll ask you the same question. What have you been playing recently you liked, board or video game?
This to me is always the most anxiety-inducing question I ever get, because I feel like I have so much responsibility to say something as an academic who works on video games, to have like some really niche, like really good arty game that just has everything. And I could say that, obviously I'm playing Pacific Drive right now, because I'm working on the Apocalypse, but my default answer has just become, and I will play it forever, and I will say this forever, Super Mario World is the perfect game, and it's like nothing will ever beat it. It is everything.
I'm just gonna leave that there and then see if my comments blow up. And then and then if you want to be found online, where can people find you and follow your work?
I guess I'm larsdewilt.eu, which just redirects to like a Google Scholar page or a link tree, I think. But that should work. Thanks for asking.
Perfect. Lars, thank you so much for coming on and talking about some serious stuff, but in toys that sell all over the world.
Thanks for inviting me.
All right, everybody out there. If you're looking for me, I can be found everywhere as Beyond Solitaire. And as usual, please like, subscribe, comment, ask questions, and most of all, happy gaming.